speaker on stage. So, everybody, as I've already mentioned, this next presentation is about the end-to-end security when fintechs are pushing the boundaries of transaction processing. And I request all of you to please welcome on stage with a round of applause the Senior Vice President, Data Security Council of India, Mr. Vinayak Godse.
Thank you, and this is nice to be part of this global fintech festival. As a Data Security Council of India, we work at the national level on public policy matters for cybersecurity. We engage with a lot of national cybersecurity initiatives of Government of India. We also work with industry on improving the preparedness of cybersecurity and also privacy. And also we engage with even law enforcement officials and some of the security agencies to look at the cyber fraud and see how we can build the capability of them to take care of the frauds that we are seeing increasing day by day because of the digitization of the payment and many other transactions which is happening basically, right? So what I'm trying to really, with some slides I have here, and we'll have some time also for discussion, is to see how exactly the ecosystem of a transaction processing is evolving. And we say this as a supply chain of a transaction processing is unbundling basically. Unbundling because there are so many different parts, so many different vendors, technologies, vendors, a lot of third parties coming to be part of those transaction processing. So they either help you to initiate the transaction, enrich the transaction, or even for that matter, even there is data that they would help you to manage the data coming out of transactions basically. So when this unbundling is happening, so then what happens to cybersecurity? How do you make sure that you still maintain the security, you still maintain the privacy expectation or satisfy the privacy expectation, and also more importantly, also make sure that it doesn't lead to the significant level of fraud. And we are seeing that happening in some part of the area and some of the challenges that we are seeing as a country, because kind of a transaction that we are processing per month, almost $7 to $8 billion number of transactions basically we are processing. And because of that, I think there's definitely digital fraud, digital security is becoming very important part. So in this 10-15 slides, I will like 8-9 times, not 15, 8-9 slides, I'll try to put together what we thought as a national level in terms of the payment or transaction security and how exactly these things are evolving. If you look at the digital payment basically, right? So digital payment, we know the payment systems, there is a lot of, this used to be discussion for 5-6 years back where there are a lot of payment ecosystems we had been seeing, the machine, the online, the contactless payment, the payment gateways. So this ecosystem is evolving. And then what basically you used to have doing the payment largely, devices are becoming very important. Whatever you have in terms of your computer or mobile variables now coming and joining transaction processing. And then your identity is becoming very important because that's why you would be recognized, you will be identified. Then there are a lot of authentication, authorization methods which evolve in recent past, like a PIN, password, biometrics, now CVV, expiry date, OTP, and then the payment instrument in India is not only the card, but nowadays bank transfer, mobile wallet, then BIM API. The payment facilitation done by the entire other ecosystem basically, right? So the ecosystem is largely the way the telecom industry, mobile ecosystem is working together, and more importantly the core basically. At the end of the day, all of that is connecting to either your bank account or limit of your credit card basically, right? So this is very simplistic representation of digital payment. 5-6 years back we used to talk about it basically. And when you talk about security, you will talk about things should go wrong. So sometimes all of the system you may have insecure configuration connectivity, you may talk about identity theft, you may talk about credential stealing, you may talk about insecure handling of the data, you may talk about phishing frauds, which is probably very important in the context of the OTP ecosystem that we try to bring, the second factor ecosystem we try to bring. We may talk about the account harvesting, you may talk about insecure connection, we may talk about the SIM card cloning. That was a problem some years back, but probably that is getting sorted quite significantly in recent past. You may talk about the rogue mobile application. That is becoming very important, critical challenge nowadays in India, especially all of those rogue mobile applications. And there are different ways the strategy is being trying to put together to deal with this problem. Then spamming is definitely one of the important part. Then this entire ecosystem, the way it is being building, so all these systems and the way you configure it, way you handle it, so that may become a major important issues and problem in terms of when we discuss about security and privacy in the payment in the system. So this 5-6 years back, we started the entire discussion of digital payment, real payment security, so 5-6 years back. But in last 6-7 years back, a lot of things has changed, right? So the entire ecosystem has changed with a lot of those innovations that are being brought by various different players, basically, and especially the fintechs, which are now pushing those boundaries, basically, pushing those boundaries of transaction processing, basically. So with this very simplistic understanding of security and privacy, I'd like to go and see what really happened in last 5-6 years of time, and how can we then think about security and privacy to make sure that we adhere some of the principles of security. More importantly, we respect the privacy expectation of the end citizen and also comply with the privacy requirements of countries, and especially India is putting together. Like in 2017, India talked about privacy as a fundamental right, as the Supreme Court underlined that, basically. Now, new data protection regulation is coming. So how that can also comply with that. And third important part is how in all this ecosystem we contain and control the frauds, digital frauds, basically. So let me now come to what exactly is happening nowadays in countries. So if you look at the digital transaction flows and payment flows in India, so there are various different ways and very different instruments are available for you. Means as an individual, be it at a remote class of the population to the modern time users, basically. So there are various different ways, basically, you can initiate the transaction. You can initiate transaction by using utility app, you can initiate transaction by using third-party payment application, card, banking transaction. So various different ways the transactions can be initiated. Various different ways the transaction can be looked at, and UPI has really paid a way, basically. UPI as a architectural intervention which has been brought this country, so had made such an interesting innovation where anybody, even email provider like Google has thought about being part of our transaction processing. Somebody like WhatsApp is now coming in, helping you to initiate transaction, basically. So such an open, citizen-centric, decentralized, inclusion-driven kind of architectural intervention has made all of these things possible. And in all of those engagements, basically, so we have these application, third-party wallets, the UPI payment ecosystem. We have the platform there are a lot of platform which has integrated with on top of the UPI, the bank account, the credit card. And in all of those exchanges, your identity, your credentials, basically, your attributes, basically, do get exchanged, basically. So ID, password, PIN, biometrics, mobile number, then sometimes the platform ID, the mobile number. So all of those attributes would be playing very important role to take care or to probably take those security decisions, basically, or to design the security in that ecosystem, basically. And all this is possible. All of those transaction flows and different ways of transactions has been possible because the way this ecosystem is now becoming more disaggregated, decentralized, at the same time integrating to do one transaction, basically. There are so many players, so many things. Means there is somebody like, we have even mobile authentication, right? For example, Touch ID or some of the biometric authentication. So now that is being leveraged to provide authentication or access to payment transaction applications as well. So somebody like a mobile device provider to somebody like a providing email services like a Google comes with a Google Pay application, basically, right? So let's try to understand if you really look at how the transaction processing happens, like there are these flows, like how exactly you onboard the customer, then you do the transaction, then what kind of transaction happens. And in all of these, if you just look at the kind of data that get exchanged, if you look at the kind of identity that get exchanged, if you look at the decisions that will be made, and a lot of these decisions from the security privacy perspective is either authentication discussion, authorization discussion, basically. And that is a core of a security of a entire payment ecosystem, basically. So how exactly you are intermediating these, exchanging these, engaging these, and probably making the data flow around this is a very important part. And now in this ecosystem, all of these complex as well as the simplified, it may be architecturally complex underlying, but it is very simple for end user, basically. It's very easy to do a transaction in a country like India, make a transaction because of the kind of innovation which has happened in terms of this unified QR code which has come into picture. And now somebody at a very remote place, even a transaction of 50 rupees, 25 rupees is being made on a digital way basically. And all of this possible because things have made together, and all of these things, all of these possibilities are come together, and at the same time they have been providing very integrated way of initiating and executing transaction. So let's try to understand this evaluation in a very structured way basically. So if you already really look at the way the financial ecosystem in a country like India, basically. So, right, for example, you have the major financial institutions like a bank, NBFC, insurance, mutual fund, and the stock exchanges as well. So these are very significant institutions which are regulated entities regulated by either by RBI, either by IRDA, either by the stock exchange regulator like a SEBI, basically, right? And then there are a lot of third-party payment processing equipment. They are also regulated entity like a credit card providers, like ATM switches, Valiant, PPI, gateways kind of organization. So they had been extending these financial institutions to make sure that the payments are possible in different ways and different element basically. Now comes very interesting thing. So the entire device and platforms, because the kind of capability that mobile has come up with, the NFCs that had come in that, the security element, the SCA, the lot of those hardware capabilities basically, the biometrics in the mobile basically. So we started now looking at this mobile and different platforms and mobile platforms to do a payment transaction processing basically. And for all of these basically, for the technology institutions, for the payment processing and for device platform, there are a lot of technology business services, and India is the center, global actual hub for all these IT BPO capabilities, and they have been providing those capabilities to these key players which are doing these transactions basically. And now on top of that, what is really happening is this ecosystem, and this is very important to understand here basically. So what is really fintech? So if you look at, it's a way, and as I was talking about the transaction processing, the way it is getting unbundled, right? Right from onboarding of a consumer to helping you to initiate transaction, enrich the transactions so decision making can be quick and risk-based and also intelligent basically, to process, helping you to process the transaction, and also after processing, managing that data basically, right? So in entire life cycle of transaction now, this is being now increasingly being either enriched, supported by the entire third-party ecosystem, fintech ecosystem basically. What they are bringing, so they are bringing the experience, they are helping you to segment and target better, they are helping you to serve your service transaction well, and helping you to even sell some of the services that you have. They are coming up with some of the advisor and assistant to do a transaction. They are offering you a lot of third-party APIs through which you can extend your payment ecosystem. They are helping you to manage documents. They are helping you to manage the regulation. They are helping you to manage the account basically. So all of those things that fintechs are being offering these capabilities, and increasingly the larger financial, bigger regulated entities have been leveraging these capabilities available. And why this is possible? Because of the technology, right? So most of these fintechs, you just go and see all these exhibitors, which is at the third floor. So they either would be leveraging those capability of RPI, the AI/ML, or big data, mobility, blockchain, cloud computing, AR/VR, IoT, biometrics. Some of them may be using presence and geospatial technology. So because of this technology, the fintechs and those innovations are now increasingly being enriched with that, and because of that, their ability to serve or to help you enrich, initiate, process transaction, and manage data out of transaction. And so even onboarding the customer becomes very easy basically. And that's why increasingly there's a tendency to make use of the fintechs to extend our entire financial services and financial ecosystem basically, and those have a lot of those things. So one is improve the scale and speed, and is one definitely objective, but other part is also inclusion. Is also so some of these innovations are very important from the inclusion perspective as well actually. So this ecosystem and these fintechs have been the way they have been pushing the transaction. So then one of the important thing is, at the end of the day, all things are underlying basically, and for the user basically, for the who is doing this transaction, it's becoming very easy to initiate and make the transaction. For example, using UPI, Google Pay, or a MobiKwik or Paytm basically, it's very easy to do transaction. But when it comes to that, the underlying ecosystem should take care of security and privacy. Because if suppose you start relying increasingly on the user basically for their security privacy consciousness basically, then probably you would create a problem for the system basically. The reliance on the user, the cognitive burden of security and privacy on the user is one of the important things for the design of security and privacy. So because because the way the transactions are rising, the way the complexity is rising, it's very, very difficult for even advanced user basically to understand, have comprehension about what could go wrong in terms of security and privacy actually. And that's why when you're designing security, when you are looking at the privacy design basically, you should make it sure that you are not putting a lot of burden on a user basically. In fact, regulatory ecosystem is also going for that way. I mean, it's increasingly making you or institutional or companies which are in the business of transaction processing more accountable for security and privacy actually. So entire this shift is happening. So if you look at GDPR, it talks about the accountability as a key principle. So somebody which is in business of collecting and processing information is made more accountable for the security and privacy basically. So what it means is that the design of a security and privacy should not put significant burden, and that is what is happening now with the OTP based transaction that we are putting cognitive burden on the user, and because of that, that's leading to a lot of challenges and issue in terms of the fraud basically. And that's why a lot of discussion are happening around this wishing fraud in the country like India basically. So how people end up sharing that OTP coming in, and there requires some user action for the security and privacy. So this is one of the important thing. Then we also need to understand the privacy issues. That it's not only security, so we need to also very good understanding about the privacy. What exactly is happening at a payment transaction processing level, which will create a privacy issues basically. So the way the sensitive information, now we are increasingly using the biometrics. So sensitive information about your biological parameters will be also captured here basically, right? Way you collect the information, the different entities that do come in terms of the collecting and processing information basically, right? And the way data is collected at different kind of instances and location basically. So and then entire vendor ecosystem where the data is flowing all across basically. So all that would be creating significant challenges for the privacy as well. So when we look at the privacy, you need to look at entire ecosystem, how exactly you distribute the ownership of privacy around this ecosystem, where so many players are coming together to make that transaction happen basically, right? So this is one of the important things that we need to address when we are looking at payment security, and this is one of the important policy interaction we discuss at a national level basically. We have been deliberating on some of those kind of possibilities basically, right? So when we look at the security and privacies, then I like to see what really happening, right? So at the Bluetooth level, at an NFC level, at a even for that matter, all the innovations are happening at a mobile level. So a lot of those technical standards are there basically, and those technical standards are helping you to really manage those transactions in a more secure way basically. A lot of cryptographic interventions are now being looked at, and a lot of standardizations are happening at technical level. We understand mostly the administrative standard like ISO 27000 and many other standards, but at technical level, those exchanges of the messages, at the technical level, those cryptographic operations that you do basically. So those are very important operations, and those are very critical operations that we need to be looking at when we are looking at the entire transaction ecosystem. But then the overall standard and those bodies have been really helping you doing this kind of effort quite significantly, but a lot of work needs to be done and a lot of research that needs to be gone into this particular thing. And then biometrics is another important area that we need to be mindful of. So now let's look at some of the security objectives and which needs to be adhered when you are looking at transaction processing basically. Which would be them basically? We talked about security, definitely adhering security is important part. We talked about privacy as well. We talked about the trust that we need to ensure, because that trust is very important for the digital inclusion, and more importantly getting people do more digital transaction basically. Trust is important, but entire ecosystem should be frictionless. It's very easy for somebody to initiate and execute a transaction. The user experience of doing transaction should be very, very important. That needs to be very enhanced user experience. The transaction process should be very fast. So we are talking about in 1 month almost 8 to 9 number of billion transactions basically processed by Indian ecosystem, and that number will still go high in the coming future basically. So the speed is important. The scale is also important. Ability to process those transactions in a 1 second is very important part, and that is very important security consideration as well. The flexibility is important. Establishing accountability is important. The non-repetition principle is very important. So all of these requirements will be very important to factor in when you're designing the payment ecosystem, basically. And then where we are now is basically, as of now, the systems are more human intervention driven, more siloed, more explicit in nature, basically. And what we are trying to look at overall authorization as well is more siloed kind of ecosystem, although that is getting too much converged. But the current thing, in terms of the way the payment ecosystem is happening, is increasingly becoming more like a privacy preserve, more like a implicit one, more like a in removing the cognitive burden on the user, more like a bringing more risk-based kind of approach to the transaction processing, more like a taking care of the fraud in the way the transactions are being processed, basically, observing the transaction, basically. So entire authentication and authorization ecosystem is built in transaction processing in such a way that security principles are adhered, but at the same time the user experience is not compromised, basically. That's what the current and future of the security of a payment ecosystem will be determined, basically. So then comes one of the important things that we need to be mindful of. So when we talk about authentication, authorization, which is very core of our transaction processing, so there are a lot of those standards, right? EMV code, there is a regulatory standard, NIST, then there's OAuth. So those standards are now increasingly, FIDO is another important standard, which is basically, and which is increasingly talking about how these things can be worked in a more standardized way so that interoperability is maintained, basically. So that is for the authentication side. If we look at authorization perspective, then SAML, SOA, so those kind of standards are evolved, and those standards are increasingly leveraged to build those systems and have that in very complex supply chain driven kind of ecosystem, make sure that the transaction is authorized in each and every where, each and every stages, basically. So those standards needs to be leveraged. And when we are doing this, so we also need to look at the technologies that are coming in the picture. So just look at the technology, basically. So the hardware level technologies are increasingly being there, and those who are getting leveraged. The mobile computing level, the NFC and Bluetooth specific ecosystem, the entire color computing, the cryptography is playing quite significant role and would be playing important role, basically. The authentication, the SSO technology, cloud architecture. So those would be very important technology consideration that to be looked at. But apart from technology, the data is very important because we are talking about risk-based authentication, risk-based decision-making, security decision-making. So those data which will be very processed for the purpose of security and privacy and fraud decision-making, basically. So when you're looking at the technology to leverage for the making it security, the data that is being available, contextual data, that also needs to be looked at. And then authentication, authorization-wise, there are a lot of things which can be talked about in terms of the where it is exactly happening at hardware level, mobile level, software level. All of those things needs to be looked at. And then authorization level, how exactly things are looking at. And then on authorization, there are a lot of those technology, orchestration, the policy-driven, the XML data formats, the web federation, machine learning, API gateways. So all these is trying to put together. So this particular slide is what it's trying to do is basically how you leverage the standard, a technical standard as well as administrative standard, to build the authentication authorization mechanism by using technology and also by using the data that is at your dispense in terms of taking those security decisions, basically, right? So when we are looking at this, basically, so we could think about possible future of a security which we just talked about in the previous slide, which will be more very implicit, very invisible to the end user, but at the same time taking care of a security, privacy at a background level, basically, and make sure that those principles are being adhered, basically. So with this encapsulated in mind for the digital payment security, so let's look at one example. So this is I tried to put together this particular thing for the contactless payment system, basically, right? If you look at, we are leveraging this Bluetooth, NFC, RFID, the voice authentication, even now in future quantum as well, and how these entire payment actions and instructions and confirmations will be done. And for that, what kind of policy standards and data is being taken into picture, and all those requirements we just talked about, non-proliferation, privacy, and look at left side pay, what kind of structures and frameworks basically, right? So for that matter, there is NPCI, some of the guidelines which talks about the payment, contactless payment ecosystem. There are national guidance as well for the contactless payment ecosystem, the different entities that we just talked about in the previous slides basically. So this is just to make contactless payment ecosystem work in the country in terms of the security and how you leverage these policies, standards and data available for you basically. So this is the framework, this is understanding, this is a kind of framework thinking for security and privacy in a digital payment ecosystem basically. And then for make this all happen, so I will probably conclude my interaction here. For digital payment security to work basically, so we need to take care of this component, right? So one is the architectural component, the contemporary security protection that you need to be bringing into the payment ecosystem. Identity management roles and access needs to be looked at. The robust security, customer onboarding needs to be looked at. Robust authentication we just talked about is very important. The role-based ecosystem is very important. The secure deployment of payment application and application development is very important. The securing communication protocols, interfaces and API is very important. The mature integration of security and making it sure, because you are using a lot of third party. And those third parties are building those applications and giving it to you basically. So it's not only your own SecOps, it's also the development process of the third parties is also very important for you. The continuous vulnerability assessment is very important part. Then the disclosure, the vulnerability disclosures, all of these elements would be very important coming forward in terms of the ensuring the end-to-end security in the way the revolution that we see in digital payment ecosystem. So these are some of those things that we work at a national level in terms of shaping some of those national policy and also work with some of the members of our Data Security Council of India in the financial sector and payment ecosystem basically. So with this, I'd like to conclude what I want to talk, but if there is some time, I believe there is 1 or 2 to 5 minutes.
Yes, we do have time, sir. We can take the Q&A. Questions, anybody? Out there. Can you have the mic in there?
So most of the payment apps needs OTP as a second factor of authentication. And like you rightly mentioned, people may be scared of sharing OTP, or they may not be knowing the consequences of sharing OTP. So if not OTP, then what do you foresee as a second?
So there is some concept of a risk-based decision making for transaction basically. There are a lot of data available for you basically, so data can be processed based on the context that you have. And there are hundreds of attributes are available which can help you to take decisions basically, right? So now people are saying that the explicit way of authenticating transaction is creating a lot of problems because of phishing fraud and onslaught of phishing fraud that we are seeing basically. So alternates are being talked about in terms of how do you ensure the adaptive risk-based authentication by looking at all the signals and take a decision on that particular spot itself basically. A significant number of transaction can go for without OTP transaction basically, and European Union, many other countries have been experimenting with that. As RBI as well, up to 5,000 rupees transaction, RBI also allowed you to not to have OTP basically, right? Because there is now inherent trust on some technology at the ground level at NFC on the chip level basically. Because of that, that is possible. But adaptive risk-based authentication is a way forward to make it authentication, security decision more implicit than explicit basically.
Thanks.
So my question was regarding, the exposing the data you talk about. Now, regulator is compelling that you should have a third-party validation for each transaction. Now, in that process, we as a consumer or this thing, we share data with payment gateway in turn share with banks and all. So in all this process, or basically bank data, name, everything is shared. So what is that basically? Who is the responsible for?
Yeah, so this is a very important question because the digitization and innovation possibility happens around data, right? And sharing of data is very critical to make sure that those possibilities are leveraged and those kind of a volume and scale that we are seeing in Indian digital payment is possible because of a lot of third-party ecosystem we brought in picture. So we may say that Google is helping us initiate transaction, but bank also need Google because Google has significant number of customers basically, right? Facebook has significant number of customers basically, or so is the WhatsApp basically. So they need each other, and that's why the possibilities of payments are basically possible. In all that, the concern of security, and more importantly, privacy is very important in this. How do you distribute the ownership privacy? And for that, the data protection regulation that Government of India is trying to put together, so that will bring quite significant data protection regime, which will bring a lot of accountability, responsibility, and also obligations and liability. Unless we have accountability, obligations, and responsibilities and liability, there will not be a kind of a sense that will prevail there, basically. So the way to address is to have very comprehensive, significant, stringent data protection regime, and then also have a very competent enforcement mechanism, basically. So that could be a possible way that things would be seen. And also regulators are also trying to see how they regulate the third-party ecosystem, not directly, but through the main regulatory entities, basically. Any other question?
Mike.
Thank you. Just a quick comment. I think you mentioned in the presentation that there's need for the fintechs to reduce the responsibility or the responsibility or the burden on the users of these products. So just you to speak more in terms of examples of the burdens that you are speaking to that should be reduced.
I talked about reducing the burden on end user when you are executing transactions. You're referring to that, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So this is very important question because what we experimented here, right? The kind of transaction processing that we are seeing in India and the regulation that we like to look at. So if there is a user action involved in taking security privacy decision, even advanced user may not have frame of mind every time. We used to do one transaction a week, but we are doing so many transactions per day, basically, right? Every transaction, you may not have that frame of mind of security privacy. If you rely on me to take security privacy decision, then that is a problem. So your security design should be such a way that the user is not burdened with those kind of considerations. So you design security in such a way that, or privacy such a way that user cognitive burden is reduced quite significantly. So you shouldn't make your security privacy dependent on user action. So that's the basic proposition that I had been talking about. Hope I answered your question. Okay, then thank you.
Yes. Is this all? I cannot see any more questions. It was indeed great listening to you, sir. Thank you.